Hi, my name is Pedro Kos, and I'm the director of Rebel Hearts.
The Immaculate Heart College was alive with highly trained, ambitious women.
They thought it was blasphemous.
Immaculate Heart Sisters drifted away from authority, and that was really the big problem.
These ladies were kick-ass and kind of subversive.
It was a marvelous statement of women.
The Immaculate Heart Sisters taught me you must follow your conscience, even if it goes against what the Pope himself has to say. If you really believe something is wrong, put your body on the line.
Hello, I'm Sonia Winesett, and this is an episode of Filmmaker Focus. Today, we have joining us Pedro Kos, director of the documentary Rebel Hearts. Rebel Hearts is a film about a group of highly educated, wildly creative, social justice-minded Catholic nuns in 1960s Los Angeles who bravely stood up to the oppressive patriarchy of the Catholic Church. This David and Goliath tale is ultimately an inspiring story about creating community, fighting for change, and what it means to sacrifice everything for what you believe in. Hi, Pedro. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sonia. So happy to be here.
So let's dive into the film. Fantastic film. I really loved it. What was the initial spark for Rebel Hearts?
When I heard the story of these extraordinary women in the mid-60s in LA, I always like to say it was like an arrow shot right through my heart. They captured my imagination in a way that I was not ready for. And the project itself predates my involvement in it for actually almost a couple decades. Our amazing writer, producer, Shawnee Isaac Smith, actually began documenting these extraordinary women starting in the late 90s. And she was able to amass an extraordinary treasure trove of interviews of the Immaculate Heart community and their founders at a time when most of them were alive and well. About 15 years later, in 2015, a mutual friend of ours, who is also an extraordinary producer, Kira Carstensen, heard about this Order of the Immaculate Heart Sisters from Shawnee. And Shawnee was looking for someone to come on board and take the project through the finish line. And so I met with Kira and Shawnee, and I watched the materials, and I was just blown away. I said that this is not only an extraordinary story, but this is those hidden gems of history.
This was like a real passion project for Shawnee, and she said that she waited for the right collaborators. Why do you think you were the right partner to bring this story to life?
Well, I admit that I'm not the natural person, the director that you would think of when thinking about a story of, nuns who stood up to the patriarchy of the church in 1960s LA. But one of the things is that for me, this story really drew a spark in my imagination. It really hit a chord, and I think Shawnee saw that. And the reason why it did is because I was raised Catholic in Brazil. But one of the things about my Catholic background is that there is actually very dueling backgrounds. There is the more progressive side of Catholicism that was very present from my father's side of the family, which is a family of doctors and very social justice minded. And then there's my mother's side of the family, which was a more conservative Catholicism. And also growing up gay in a Catholic country with these two dueling ideologies from Catholicism, I knew that conflict runs right through the middle of me because it's something so personal. And that's why it sparked my imagination, because it was an order of women who saw outside an institution, saw beyond an institution, to really connect to what their true faith and to what their true calling, and the calling to live out the gospel in a way that they felt called to do, and to bring peace, justice, understanding, and love to their community. And so that's what I saw, and that's why it really sparked in me my imagination and a passion that I knew that I had to dive in.
And what were some of the challenges you faced stepping into a project that had pretty much started over 15 years before you came into the scene?
Absolutely. Well, there were many, but we always had a saying in our edit room, which was, "What would Karita do?" Which was code for think outside the box. So the project really came with many challenges, but also came with many opportunities, because it taught us, and these sisters taught us, to think beyond what's expected, to think creatively about what really means to tell their story and how to tell it in a way that's alive and that is immersive and that takes you on a wild ride along with them. When I came on board, we amassed an exorbitant amount of archival materials, but we still didn't have enough to tell all sections and all parts of the story. So that challenge, we then started like, how can we tell these parts of the story where we don't have materials, where we don't have photographs? There were no photographers when Cardinal Mcintyre stormed and berated the sisters for their reforms. But we thought about animation because we were inspired by Sister Karita's artwork. And in the same vein, in the same spirit, we wanted to tell those sections of the story that really brought it to life in a unique way. And our amazing producer, Judy Koren, had worked with this extraordinary Icelandic animator called Una Lorentzen. And when I saw Una's work, Judy and I were both knew that it was Una that had to come on board, because her style was so reminiscent of the serigraphs of Karita that we knew it was an instant aesthetic connection. And Una felt that same way as well. So we started working with Una and doing some sequences, and it just clicked right away.
And the animation, the visual language of the film, it wasn't just to fill in the gaps, right? You wanted to find a way to immerse the viewer into the story, correct?
Absolutely. You know, I say I fall in love with stories. These stories take me on a journey, on a ride that really changes the way I see the world. And I would like, as a filmmaker, to create an immersive experience for viewers, to transport them, and to show them maybe an unexpected story. And I think the animation really provided a window to experience the philosophy of these sisters, to go beyond the confines of structures that all of us are part of, and to think outside the box. And so I think Una's animation really kind of had that spirit. And also, the other thing is the sisters' sense of humor. They are extraordinarily funny, witty, and there is something about the animation that captures their levity and their sense of humor and playfulness.
I can hear the Cardinal, to some of this as he reads it, knowing how you react, say, "You're not going to tell me, well, I'm going to run my schools."
And I also read that the Irregular Bulletin, the Immaculate Heart Community's periodical, was a stylistic influence for you. How did that inspire you in creating an almost layered, tactile approach to this film?
So we came across the Irregular Bulletin at the archives of the Immaculate Heart Community, and it was this graphic revelation. It was so wonderfully expressive and experimental. So we looked at this Irregular Bulletin, and we saw how it could inform our cinematic language, especially in the graphic design, in the motion graphics. And so we began experimenting with the design and kind of creating a unified language, and how to bring all these disparate elements like archival footage, newspaper headlines, photographs, and do it in a way that's playful. There were amazing audio recordings of their meetings where they're really debating and coming to grips with what their true calling was.
Testing. 1, 2.
But what to do visually there. The Irregular Bulletin, so you can have a little bit of fun with that. You can take the pictures, you can take the transcripts of what they're saying and do it in a way that's really dynamic and that's alive. And we had an extraordinary motion graphics team that really took that to heart and followed that aesthetic from the Irregular Bulletin.
Let's talk about Cardinal Mcintyre. He was called the Education Cardinal. He built over 60 schools in Los Angeles, and the Immaculate Heart Sisters staffed those schools. I mean, the nuns were essentially free labor, many of whom lacked a college degree, let alone a teaching credential. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for us in 2022 is shocking. It's really shocking to hear, because you basically, as you said, you're talking about free labor, and you're talking about educators who were responsible for shaping the minds of the next generation. And these women took their role as educators extremely seriously, and they wanted to be the best educators possible. Now, when you decide to become a nun, you take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But to see that not only were they not paid, but they were put in really poor conditions, teaching in overcrowded classrooms of 80 plus kids, where basically they felt like they were failing as educators. They were failing to give the best education to their students.
The Immaculate Heart Sisters were the largest community staffing our schools.
In a church school, the cardinal had authority over that school. It wasn't our school just because we taught there. Those were his schools. And so the pressure was put on communities to staff the schools beyond what was right educationally.
I think Cardinal Mcintyre viewed women, at least nuns in this diocese, as coolie labor for his schools.
McIntyre was a genius, financial genius, because he realized that the greatest cost in almost everything is your salaries. You must remember that in those days, nuns, they didn't get much of a salary.
We've taught for free, no Social Security, no pension, no salary.
We used to say the nuns took the vow of poverty and we kept it.
So the first day of school arrived, and I brought my class up to the classroom, and I thought, oh my God, what do I do with all these kids? 83 6th and 7th graders.
My first class was 80 kids.
I don't know to this day how many students I had. Maybe 70, maybe 80. The door would open and the priest would shove a couple more kids in. And I didn't have the skills that would have helped to do the kind of job that should have been done.
I mean, I didn't have a college degree at that point, let alone a teaching credential.
The idea was you put on a habit, you're teaching the kids. Your habit teaches them.
For the majority of us, we were teaching and then gradually got our college education, going to classes on Saturday for a very long time.
But on the other hand, you don't need an advanced degree sometimes to teach third grade. You need a bunch of common sense.
There were legions of young nuns in classrooms where all they felt was defeat.
And that's one of the things that all of them really talked about, was that the situation was becoming untenable, because as Cardinal Mcintyre was trying to grow the archdiocese, he was really able to create that expansion because of the free labor of the sisters.
We have in our parochial schools today in this country 6 million children. And that's why I am standing up for true religion in our schools.
You didn't really have to think of, how do I pay the teaching staff? They would just bring in more sisters. And that very rapid expansion took a huge toll. And I think that's a lot of what people call rebellion, was basically them realizing that they were failing in their duty as educators and they wanted to reform. And they started asking questions.
The 1960s were a time of cultural upheaval for society and for the Roman Catholic Church. Can you talk about the Vatican II reforms and how it intended for the Church to more closely connect with the contemporary world?
Exactly. And so in the late 50s, with the election of Pope John the 23rd, there was a call to reform the church, to open the church. The church was seen as very insular, and there was this huge call to make the church a part of the world. And that really kind of went along with the spirit of the times. Pope John the 23rd convened the Second Vatican Council to reform the church and bring the church, the Catholic Church, into the 21st century.
The Vatican Ecumenical Council. This is only the second in 400 years. The Council's immediate aim is to make church laws more compatible with modern times.
The Council produced 16 documents designed to modernize the role of the Church in world affairs.
All the decrees of Vatican II brought enormous change to the culture of the Church. For instance, the Mass changed to be said in the local language instead of in Latin. And in the pre-Vatican II days, there was this old thing about women's blood being polluting. And so women were not allowed into the sanctuary. But you suddenly had women serving in the area around the altar. That sent shockwaves.
There were many decrees that were issued, and one of the decrees was calling all religious orders to go back to their founding documents and analyze what their true calling was in the world and how to be a part of that world. And the Immaculate Heart Sisters took that to heart. They really obeyed that document to the T. They analyzed, they assembled and discussed what their role was and how to reform their own order to make it a part of the world and be a part of the modern world.
And one of those things that they wanted to address was the nun's habit. I mean, you know, Anita asked the question in the film, why is dressing like a medieval woman supposed to make one more holy? What's your take on this?
Well, I think Anita is just, what an extraordinary mind, because she gets to the heart of the matter. Why in an external outfit of a former century is supposed to impose your religious calling? But to them, the issue of the habit was not front and center. I mean, they were, I think they were a lot more worried about their role as educator and their ability to educate their students. But the media and everyone at that time was really caught up with the fact that they shed their habits. I mean, there were other religious orders around the country beginning to make the same reforms. But because Cardinal Mcintyre was of a very different mindset, it basically created this fertile ground for a showdown.
It would appear that the action of the chapter presents to the Archdiocese of Los Angeles an ultimatum. Our policy, as stated, is that we wish sisters teaching in our parochial schools to wear a uniform habit that is immediately recognizable as the garb of a woman dedicated to the service of God in religion.
They were expected to wear a habit and teach them because they'd always worn a habit.
It is evident, therefore, that the decision rests with your community.
The media and Cardinal Mcintyre really harped upon the whole issue of the habit and the fact that they were being rebellious and shedding the habit against the rules of the cardinal. But what was not discussed was the fact that they were following the decrees of the Second Vatican Council that called these orders to reform and to become more in tune with what was going on at that time.
In keeping with the modernization of Catholic liturgy and ecumenical thought, the tradition-bound dress of nuns is being altered radically.
The official document that came out of Vatican II said experiment in stages. And then after a few years, you know, good scientific method, you re-examine them again.
So as all the little changes and experiments continued, we began to see more and more discussion on the issue of the habit.
Why dressing as a medieval woman dresses would make one more Christian, more holy. It's hard now to figure out. We have to drive cars, we have to board planes, we have to do all kinds of things that make this out of place.
One of the things that Dorothy Dunn talks about in the film is that the habit really created a barrier to students. And when you're not able to dialogue and share ideas with someone that you feel is so far away from your own reality, then that's going to provide a huge barrier. And what the Immaculate Heart Sisters were all about was opening up and discussing everything. And they felt that a lot of times that habit would really get in the way because of how it would influence the students. And you can actually see that in the film. The BBC interviewer that's interviewing Sister Dorothy when she was still a sister in her habit, he says, I find you completely different. Everything that he shares and believes, she was the exact opposite, and he could never engage in meaningful dialogue with her.
How long is it since you've worn the habit?
This last October, which I guess is about 6 months, isn't it?
And now that you've got your habit on again, do you really feel exactly the same, dressed like that, as you do in your ordinary clothes?
No. Never realized that till just now, I don't think, but no, I don't.
That experience with him, just in a few minutes, was a lesson for me because I had actually argued against changing the habit in the beginning of the whole thing. I thought it was a kind of silly issue.
Does anybody here feel that it's a pity that they've removed the habit?
Well, I know that having a woman in some kind of dress from a completely another period automatically does put up a barrier. And this way, well, you know that they're people, they're now people.
I find you completely different. I find my response to you totally different now. And I've seen you and talked to you in your civilian clothes.
Yeah, I would want to ask you what you mean by totally different.
I feel a certain kind of an awareness of the fact that you won't ever be able to agree with any point of view that I may hold on any serious subject. That will always be modified by the odor of sanctity. And secondly, that I have got to censor my speech, my activities, and the way I express things so as not to put you in an awkward position.
So that's the core of the reason. But it became this sort of cause célèbre about, you know, the rebellious nuns that are shedding the habit. And it really goes much, much beyond that.
Pat Reef compares these antiquated rules that controlled, you know, the sisters' lives with the restrictions put on people in mental institutions. I think she and a few of the other sisters had read Asylum. Can you talk about some of those, you know, rules that she was referring to?
As a nun, you have a lot of rules and regulations that you're supposed to follow. And so it's really funny to hear a lot of these women discuss their restrictions.
We realized pretty soon that there were elements in religious life that really were, you know, not too rational.
The bell rang and we all went to Mass at the same time. We were not supposed to speak in the convent unless it was a matter of charity. It was what we called the day silence.
Many of us read a book called Asylums about mental institutions. And when we read it, we began to realize that the same kinds of restrictions that were put on people in mental institutions were also the kinds of rules that controlled our lives.
I'd spent long hours on my knees, long hours learning how to keep dust off the library books and learning how to care for elegant old hardwood floors. I perceived myself to be really advancing in holiness.
My superior insisted that the youngest person at the dining table eat whatever was left on the platters. So if somebody didn't eat their poached egg, then I had to eat 2. I gained 15 pounds.
The minor rules and the infinitesimal attention to detail in every part of our lives was meant, I think, to make us simply obey.
It did feel like they were in a mental institution or a prison because everything was regulated to the T. And that felt very limiting, especially if you had different duties as teachers or as a nurse. You had very different demands on your schedule. So it became a real burden for so many of them to follow these ridiculous regulations about, having curfew. And a lot of the sisters actually, in order to staff the increasingly overcrowded schools, were teaching during the day and then had to study at night to earn their teaching degrees. So they were not able to make their curfew. They were supposed to be inside the convent, but I don't know, but I think, if I remember correctly, around 6 or 7 p.m. A lot of them were still studying and were working at that hour. And so they would have to bend themselves backwards into a pretzel in order to maintain with those very restrictive rules.
There's an archival soundbite in the cold open title sequence where a man says, "The Cardinal feels that they are moving out of safe Christianity." What do you think he meant by safe Christianity?
Lines like that about safe Christianity or about the rebellious sisters, it was really in reaction to change. Rebel Hearts is really a film that's a meditation on change and how change happens.
The 60s were a time when people were saying, open up your minds to what's going on. And the college was very much part of that world. But this was a very conservative Catholic community in Southern California, to the degree that good Catholics were not sending their daughters to Immaculate Heart College because they felt it was a little dangerous.
So at a certain point, the Cardinal started censoring the faculty.
The problem with Immaculate Heart College was that it was very difficult for many Catholics to endure because the one thing people hate is change.
I think for so many of us, change can be really scary. And anything different, anything that's outside of what you're used to or outside of the norms can throw you off your center. And one of the things that, again, Dorothy says, it's very easy to have these sisters in this medieval habit, and they're the ones that are supposed to take care of the holy part of life. They got the holiness so that you can go about your own day and doing your own thing. The beautiful thing for me about the Immaculate Heart Sisters was that the holy is in everyday life.
Mary's Day was lots of fun. And I loved, getting those flowers around my habit and doing the dance on the lawn. And I thought it was the kind of celebration that churches ought to have regularly.
We did all these things to visually represent how Mary was seen by the people at the college, which was as an inspiration to all things good and holy.
One of the things that Carita did was elevate the quotidian, the supermarket basket, the advertisement, and taking very everyday things from our lives and elevating through art. Everything is holy. Everything is sacred in many ways. Life is sacred. And I think to put in a compartment and that's holy and here we live our day-to-day secular lives is very comfortable to say. But they were beginning to dig deeper and ask deeper questions about what is holy. And that's what you're seeing, I think, is a reaction to what's different. And that is not a story or a thing that is about the 60s. I think that's as current as any topic in so many ways that are very reminiscent of the 1960s.
So the film opens with Lenore Dowling at the Women's March in 2017. Can you talk about that choice to lead with that clip with Lenore at the Women's March?
It was always very important for us, for the whole team, that the film, that Rebel Hearts, be grounded in the present moment. Because it's about today. It's about grappling with change. It's about the issues. It's about equality. It's about opening up our doors. And it's about being a part of the world and being tuned with the times. And so it felt only appropriate to begin the film in the present. And especially because this community, this Immaculate Heart community continues to be a part of the world, continues to be out there working with immigrant rights, ministering to prisoners, working with issues in the environment. They are very active in the issues and the politics that we are currently grappling with as a society. Lenore Dowling is marching at the Women's March at 90 years old. So because they are such a strong part of today's world, we felt that it was really important to ground the film in the present.
Immaculate Heart College wasn't directly under the authority of Cardinal Mcintyre. So the nuns had much more freedom there than they did, in the high schools or the other schools. Can you talk about how that created fertile ground for every department essentially to flourish at the college?
Yeah. Immaculate Heart College was basically the heart of the Immaculate Heart community. It was right next to the mother house where most of the sisters lived. It was where all the sisters were educated and prepared to become educators in all the schools that they staffed. And one of the things that it was known, especially in the 50s and 60s, was one of the best liberal arts colleges for women in the United States.
Cardinal Mcintyre wanted everything under his authority, directly under his authority. But Immaculate Heart College was our school. We owned it. So we had much more freedom there.
Immaculate Heart College, a college which promises its students, you will become part of the tidal wave of exploration and never be the same.
I was very happy when I got an assignment to teach at the college.
It's obvious, I think, that anyone who teaches or works in a college has much more freedom, in many ways, than one who teaches in the other part of the structure.
Unlike the sisters who taught in the elementary and high schools, those of us who taught in the college went on to get our PhDs. So the college was an exciting place to be, which made teaching really fun, really fun. We were able to be part of the world and in tune with the issues of the day.
It was an extraordinary institution because they were really at the forefront of a lot of the issues, and from the art department to the science department to the English department, what this order did was to send their sisters, after they had their bachelor's degrees, they would send them to the best institutions in the world to get their masters and their PhDs. For example, Sister Anita had a master's from USC and a PhD from Stanford in literature. And they would send the sisters teaching science to MIT to earn their masters and their PhDs so they could come back and teach at Immaculate Heart College.
The Immaculate Heart College was alive with highly trained, very bright, professionally ambitious women.
We would like to be able to say that a women's college is freer.
This was a time when very few women received a college degree.
The nuns who were college faculty had more degrees among them than all the priests in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
The art department, Sister Carita, became the icon of pop art because they saw in Carita the potential and really the aptitude of an artist. So they paid for her to get her master's in art at USC. And that's how she took up the serigraph, because she thought working with the serigraph was a great way to teach students art. And then she started making her own art.
In those days, I was surrounded by some of the best women you could ever meet. And these were all people in different fields. I'm sure if I had been a nice, proper housewife, I would not have, bumped into all of these ideas. And then, of course, once they get into you, you start noticing and expanding too.
So it was really a place that was very alive, and it was so in tune with the time, and people really responded to it.
Well, the people that didn't respond to it was Cardinal Mcintyre and the Archdiocese. They pretty much forbid her from depicting the Holy Family. Can you discuss how that forced Carita to move in the direction she did with her work?
The fascinating thing is that as Carita was beginning to evolve, her artwork was, at the beginning was very faith-oriented. She was depicting the Holy Family, Jesus and Mary and Joseph and biblical scenes, the wedding in Cana, Pentecost. Unfortunately, Cardinal Mcintyre had a very narrow view of what was supposed to be religious art. So he was really offended by some of Carita's artworks and began censoring her, trying to censor her. So he basically demanded that she stop depicting biblical figures in her artwork. And so basically that led her to go into a more abstract graphical treatments with popular sayings. She then starts looking at modern advertising and things like Wonder Bread or Sunkissed, and seeing the holiness in everyday life, in the bread basket, in the supermarket, in the fruits and vegetables that we all go and buy every day. I guess her evolution as an artist, you can also attribute partially because of Cardinal Mcintyre's censorship, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, the progressive attitude of the nuns seemed to enrage Cardinal Mcintyre.
The most dramatic moment of Cardinal Mcintyre's disapproval of us, he had announced that he was coming to visit us. The General Council was having its meeting, and the Cardinal came in upon it and told us that we were becoming much too modern, that we would have to follow what he said. He scared me most when he said, if this goes on, I shall have to close the college. At the end of the conversation, he said, you will suffer for this.
He seemed to be motivated by fear, but if so, what is he afraid of?
I think he had a lot to be afraid of. Cardinal Mcintyre grew up in a time in the 1910s and 20s where there was really kind of a pushback against the more intellectual formation of priests and clergy. It was really a time of good and bad, good and evil, black and white. So there was no room for questioning. He was a power structure kind of guy.
The priests in New York were said to have been very happy when McIntyre came to Los Angeles because they thought they were going to have it easy when he left. Because he was tough. I mean, he wanted something done. He'd ask you to do it. He'd want it done yesterday.
He was rigid about everything. I mean, he wore a hat. I was his secretary. I had to wear a hat. Hated wearing a hat.
So when you have an order that's beginning to think outside the box and to question things a little bit more, he felt that it threatened his view of the world, that black and white view of everything needs to be in a certain box and a certain structure. And these Immaculate Heart Sisters, who were extraordinary critical thinkers, saw beyond that structure. And you're right, it was out of fear because that was a threat to the way he saw the world.
I mean, it's so easy to put him in the role of the antagonist, the Goliath to the David that the nuns represented. But you were able to interview Clement Connolly. Why do you think it was important to have his perspective on the cardinal?
I think it's extraordinarily important to humanize the cardinal, and Monsieur Clement Connolly really did that because he was his assistant, and he understood where the cardinal came from, and the cardinal as a product of his time and his education, and the hardships that the cardinal faced. And so the cardinal was really following what he was basically taught, what was right and wrong. And Clem brings that perspective, that humanity, and contextualizes why the cardinal was such an antagonist to the Immaculate Heart Sisters.
Cardinal Mcintyre was shaped, formed, and anointed into a church that was authoritarian. He felt that if you opposed him, you were opposing the church, and you were doing something that would hurt the church or that was ungodly.
Because it was very motivated from we think, from a deeply personal place.
Mm. Was there any one participant or, subject that made an impression on you? And if so, why?
I mean, it's hard to talk about a particular subject because one of the things about the Immaculate Heart Sisters, you fall in love with the individual sisters and you fall in love with the community. The protagonist in the film, we feel, is not Anita, is not Carita, is the community. So I can talk about Anita, about Carita, about Patrice Underwood, about Pat Reef, and all. I mean, the list goes on because each of them were extraordinary and inspiring and deeply affected every single person on this team. Pat Reef was an extraordinary mind and was so open and was really putting her body on the line, going to anti-war movements, really being that voice of conscience that the world really needs.
Were you ever arrested for any of your protests?
Yes. A lot of times.
It's not as simple as talking jive.
If you really believe something is wrong, then it's important to put your body on the line.
Or Carita through, her art and her philosophy in not only art, but teaching and how she taught her students. They were not easy teachers. It was not like an easy A, but they taught critical thinking. Anita is another example. To her, being a leader was to serve. And to serve for the betterment of the whole community, not a power structure. She wasn't someone that was going to be ruffling feathers of a cardinal.
Probably many of you are wondering, just what are those Immaculate Heart Sisters up to?
But her sense of duty and her sense of her faith spoke a lot louder.
He just couldn't see what we were doing or why we were doing it. It seemed wrong to him.
Is there a particular moment in the film that resonated with you? And if so, what was it about that particular scene that was especially compelling for you?
I'll single out the moment of their 1967 assembly, which you hear the audio recordings of in the film. This is a moment where they're passing their amendments. They're basically writing their new constitution. And it's resonated with me because you see a community grappling with change in a way that's not impulsive or light. It was all so deeply thought out. And you see them questioning the structures that they're part of, the structure of the church. How do you fit into a structure that is oppressive? And maybe one of them says, well, maybe it's time for us to think outside of the structure.
We have a very wealthy, a very powerful, a very large archdiocese. We'd have to be very careful, or even by changing things at this state, we might jeopardize everything.
We knew Cardinal Mcintyre had told us very early that unless we stopped our course of making changes, that we would pay dearly.
What if what we want is really larger than the structure?
Well, and that's what we're wanting. And I think that therein is going to be our contribution to the church.
My feeling was that those in authority in the archdiocese were intrusive and unjust, and that as women religious, we could determine our own destiny.
It was time to just take the bull by the horns and vote for all the changes.
The will of the community will be determined by vote.
The motion is to vote on a college education as a qualification.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The amendment is passed. All in favor? Aye.
Proposal 27.
I remember making the motion on the floor that we make the wearing of the habit voluntary.
We move that the sisters be allowed to wear clothes of their choice.
And it passed.
So out of that year's assembly came what are essentially our decrees on the spirit in which we govern ourselves.
I was aware that something great was happening. The ground was beginning to break underneath.
As I look back on it now, I see it as really a marvelous, incredible statement of women.
It must have been a terrible shock for the Cardinal, because he'd never come up against anything like this before.
How are you personally inspired by the courage of these extraordinary sisters who were moved by their faith to stand up to a patriarchal institution?
One of the things that they really taught me is to think very deeply and intentionally about who you are and what your role is in this larger world, and to be a part of the world. I think that's one of the greatest inspirations, is to embrace community, whatever that community may be, whether that's your collaborators, whether that's your family, whether that's your friends, or whether that's a movement that you're a part of. But they taught me that to get through some of that change and to create change, it's harder traveling by yourself. And it's so isolating being in your own head. I think it's really kind of opening your minds and opening your horizons and doing it with intention and doing it with love and also a great sense of humor. I think I learned from the Immaculate Heart Sisters. They were constantly teaching all of us that.
And if I were to ask you the question, what do you want audiences to take away from the film? Would you have a different answer for me?
I think it would be very much that, and I would say check your expectations at the door. These are not your regular nuns. So let yourself be carried by the imagination of these women and taken with their journey, because I surely did, and they definitely changed me. So.
Well, this is an extraordinary film, and I hope everyone, goes to Discovery Plus and streams it, because I think we can all learn something from these extraordinary sisters. So thanks so much for coming on, Pedro, and talking about your documentary. It's really fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much, Sonia. It's been such a pleasure and joy to speak with you.